little bit more elaborate in these devices. Now, because I checked the weather this morning, and I was very happy to have a fellow fly me down, but the weather looked kind of bad, and I really wasn't too sure whether I was going to make it to Decatur or not, and maybe we get lost someplace and land in some strange field. I brought with me the Mark 1 Mod 1 waste management system in case I really got scared and had to use it, and I have it right here. This is it. It's a plastic bag. Notice it has an opening up here. Notice that it also has a lip. Now, this is the actual flight article with the exception that I removed the glue from this lip. Normally on top of the glue is little wax paper, like those little signs you get when you go to a party. Peel off. Let me set the scene. Gemini 7, 2-week mission. Frank Borman is right there. 5 days have gone by. Finally, Frank looked at me and said, "Jim, this is it." I said, "Frank, you have only 9 more days left to go." I'm not going to go into how this thing works. I just want to tell you that it was there and then that I found out that position in life was everything. The problem we had, I thought you might be interested in. I came back and then I flew the last Gemini mission with Buzz Aldrin, Gemini 12. It wound up a very successful program. We learned a lot about space flight. It was mostly research and development. Then we went on into Apollo. My next assignment was a flight, which I think most of you remember. It's Apollo 8. It was going to be an Earth orbital mission. And we were planning for it in 1968. We were going to have a lunar module and a command module. And we were going to go up in lunar orbit and then about 4,000 miles in the apogee, and then just test out all the vehicles to make sure everything works and come back and land. 2 things happened in the summer of 1968 that changed our mission. The first thing was that Grumman Aircraft finally realized that they would never get the lunar module ready in time to make a flight in the year of 1968. They were just behind, and they decided that, let's take it easy and make it right the first time. The second thing was that we had some information that the Soviet Union was going to put a man around the moon in the late fall of 1968. As a matter of fact, they sent 2 spacecraft around the moon and back, a spacecraft called Zond 5 and Zond 6. They had small animals in the spacecraft, and they recovered them in the Pacific. But the trajectory of which they had at that particular time was such that the re-entry was so great that the animals did not survive, and consequently they abandoned the plans of putting a man in a circumlunar flight right around and coming back. We, of course, did not know that information at the time, and consequently we looked at our own plans and said, well, look, why don't we send the command module around the moon, we'll orbit the moon. We don't have a lunar module, but we'll orbit the moon and we'll look for landing sites for the lunar landing mission, and this will also check out the navigation and the communication system. And that's how it came to pass that on December 21st, 1968, Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and I launched on the first Saturn V going to the moon. It really was an auspicious flight, probably my most memorable flight. I'll never forget it. It took us about 3 days to get there. The last half day, our blunt end was towards the moon, so we never saw the moon as it got bigger and bigger and bigger. The ground fellow had said at exactly such and such a time you'll lose communication, because the moon will pull you around by its gravity so that it's between you and the Earth. Exactly at the time that they told us, static in the earphones, lost communication with the Earth. I was the navigator on this flight. I was operating the computer. I was planning the computer, or programming I should say, to light our maneuvering engine to slow down so that the moon's gravity would capture us and we would be a satellite of the moon. At the proper time, the engine lit, fired and then shut down, and then on the display of the computer it said, "You are now in lunar orbit, you know, your orbit is 60 by 130 miles. But we didn't see any moon. You know, we didn't see it when the communication stopped. All we saw was black velvet sky. Now, the moon must be rather large with it this close. And then we rotated about 180 degrees around, and they're slowly going by where the ancient old craters on the back side of the moon. Really the most awe-inspiring sight I'll ever see. You don't see the back side of the moon from the Earth. As it revolves around the Earth, it rotates on its axis such that it always keeps the backside away from us. Consequently, we were the first people to really see the backside. Now, the Soviets had pictures of the backside, and so did we. So we knew where some of the craters were, but no one had seen them live before. As we came around to the front side, Frank Borman and I were looking ahead, and out of the horizon came the Earth. Bill Anders was down into the spacecraft looking at the craters and taking pictures. He was in charge of photography. When the Earth came up, it was really a beautiful sight. It was the only color that we could see from that position in space. The moon, regardless of what photographs you have seen of it, is nothing but all shades of gray. You know, sometimes photography will make it blue or brown or green or something like that, but it's all shades of gray. The stars are very brilliant. They don't twinkle because there's no atmosphere to look at them through. But that many more stars than on a dark, clear night out in the countryside where there are no city lights. The sun, of course, is too brilliant to look at because there's no atmosphere to sort of attenuate the rays. But the Earth is very beautiful. You can see the blue oceans, of course. You can see the swirling clouds. You can see the pinks, the salmons, the browns of the desert areas of say, North Africa, Mexico, and that area. And you can see the polar areas because the Earth came up on its side as we saw it. You know, the North Pole and the South Pole. You can see those ice caps. Very, very, very pretty. Frank and I both said, we've got to take a picture of that. Anders, again in charge of photography, said, hold it. He didn't see the Earth, of course. He said, we have only so many frames of film. We can't waste them taking pictures of the Earth. Then he looked up and saw this beautiful Earth coming out of the lunar horizon. He said, by gosh, we've got to take a picture of that. All three of us took pictures of Earthrise. One of those photographs became very famous. In 1969, a stamp was made of the photograph. It has been on just about every public and private publication known to man. I'm sure everyone here has seen it at some time or another. Now, in your travels, if you happen to run into Frank Borman, ask Frank who took the picture of Earthrise. He'll say, I was commander of that flight. Obviously, it was my photograph. If you run into Bill Anders, who is now vice president with Textron, ask Bill who took the picture of Earthrise, and he'll say, well, I was in charge of photography. I took the picture. Ladies and gentlemen, I took that picture. It'll be a raging controversy for the next 20 years. It keeps us all alive just arguing about that one particular thing. One last thing about Apollo 8 I thought I'd just mention. We arrived around the moon on Christmas Eve. Gosh, what an appropriate time to say something. But we knew that we were going to arrive there a couple months ahead of time as we planned our flight. What could we say? Well, we decided let's change the words to the night before Christmas. That didn't sound too good. Couldn't think of anything, to put in. How about a new verse to Jingle Bells? Couldn't think of anything about that either. Finally, there was a fellow who was with the U.S. Information Agency. He had gone along with several of the crews around the world with these, goodwill tours that they had. And he said, you'll arrive at the moon at a very auspicious time, but Christmas is a Christian holiday, and the majority of the people listening to you, because the whole world will be tuned into this particular flight, are not Christian. Why don't you say something that is apropos to the majority of the people? And that's how it came to pass that on our last orbit, or 9th orbit or 10th orbit of the moon, with that little TV camera, the little black and white one that we had, focusing on the surface, that we read from the Old Testament, the first 10 verses of Genesis, which is the foundation of many of the world's religions. It was a very successful flight. Everything worked. Unbeknownst to us watching it on TV, a lot of times on these space flights things fail, but this time everything worked perfectly, and it was a nice beginning of the Apollo program. I was recycled to a flight called Apollo 13. This is to be the third lunar landing. By this time, 11 and 12 had landed on the moon. I was the backup to Neil on Apollo 11. I was to make sure he was healthy, so I wouldn't have to take his place. I exposed him to the measles. That didn't work. Opened up a manhole cover, thought he might break a leg or something like that. No, he was too healthy. Apollo 13 was going to go into the hills of the moon. If you look at the moon, even with your naked eye, you'll see dark areas and light areas. The dark areas are the mare, or the seas. The bright areas are the hills, the highlands. The geologists thought that, the material in the dark area might be different than the material in the light area. And since we had brought back rocks from the seas, let's bring back rocks from the highlands of the hills. Our job was to go to a place called Frau Maro, right in about the center of the moon. Takeoff on this flight was on April 11th, 1970, at 13:13 Central Standard Time. Right there, I should have known something was going to happen. Vehicle took off fine, the old Saturn V rumbled up, and we're on our way. We took a course to the moon that was called free return. The big rocket put us on this course because once we got rid of the rocket, if our maneuvering engine didn't fire, our course would take us around the moon's gravity will pull us around and take us back towards the Earth, hopefully to make a safe landing on the Earth. And that's why it's called free return. About 30 hours out, ground called up and said, "Say, if you want to land at this place called Frau Maro, you'll have to get off the free return course." We said, fine, it'd been done before. They said, because, if you don't get off the free return course, you will never see the shadows of the rocks and to land and to miss all the rocks. So they told us how to maneuver the spacecraft. We lit the maneuvering engine. It worked perfectly. We moved over to another course to the moon now. This was the course we called a hybrid course. It would take us around the moon, should something happen to the engine, and back towards the Earth, but the closest point of approach to the Earth would be about 2,500 nautical miles out, much too far out to be captured by the Earth's atmosphere. We didn't worry about it. Done before. We settled down for a very quiet, nice, tranquil flight to the moon. And about 56 hours after we took off on this flight, our two spacecraft now mated together, the lunar module and the command module. Fred Hayes, who was the lunar module pilot on this flight, and I went through the tunnel. I had a television camera in my hand. It was the second day out. I was photographing him floating around. We were just checking the lunar module. I had just finished the television program, which was being down to the control center in Houston. And I was coming down through the tunnel when I heard a sharp bang. The spacecraft rocked back and forth a little bit. Everything was quiet. Well, I looked up at Fred to see what the situation was. Did he know what caused the bang? And I could tell from his expression that he didn't know what caused the bang. Then I took a look over at our third person on this flight, a fellow named Jack Swikert, and his eyes were as white as saucers. Not only did he not know what caused the bang, but he was saying to himself, "Why am I here?" You see, Swikert was not the prime crew member on this flight. A man by the name of Ken Mattingly was the prime crew member. About 4 days before we were to take off, we found out that Mattingly was exposed to the measles. And his blood work indicated that there was no doubt that Mattingly was going to come down with the measles about the time we were ready to come home from the moon. So NASA pulled him off and put him as backup, Jack Swikert. Well, the first thing that, and I was down over on the right-hand side, and the first thing that I saw on a warning panel system, much like we have in automobiles today, a red light came on that said something is wrong with your electrical system. And then 2 more lights came on and said you have just lost 2 out of 3 of your fuel cells. Now, a fuel cell is a device where we use liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, mix it together, and we get electrical power and water. This was our major source of electrical power. Our mission rules stated that if you lose a fuel cell, the landing is off. even though one fuel cell was more than sufficient just to get you around the moon and get you home again. So at that time, there was a wave of disappointment in the spacecraft. Here, my second flight up here, worked months to land on the moon, and now we lose a couple fuel cells, and we can't land on the moon. Then I drifted to the center of the spacecraft, and I looked up at the instrument panel to those instruments that told me the condition of two huge liquid oxygen tanks that were located way in the back of my spacecraft. The quantity gauge of one, the needle read 0. And on the quantity gauge of the second tank, I could actually see the needle go down, something you would normally never see on the usage of oxygen in a space flight. And that's when the old lead weight started to go down to the bottom of my stomach, and I realized that I was getting to be in deep trouble. Then I wandered over to where Jack was sitting on the couch, and I looked out the window. It was a side window, and I could see escaping at a high rate of speed a gaseous substance. And it didn't take much intelligence on my part to realize that the gas escaping from the rear end of my spacecraft and the needle of my second and last oxygen tank were one and the same, and very shortly we'd be completely out of oxygen. And when that occurred, because we used oxygen to produce electricity, we'd be completely out of electrical power. And when that occurred, because we gimbaled our maneuvering engine by means of electricity, we would lose our propulsion system. We were in deep trouble. We did have, in the spacecraft itself, a little battery that would last about 5 hours, and a little oxygen tank that would last the same time. They were used merely in the final phases of the flight through the atmosphere after we had jettisoned our major sources of consumables. But at the time the explosion occurred, we were some 200,000 miles from Earth. We were some 90 hours from Earth because we had to go around the moon to get home. And we were going in the wrong direction. Earth was back there. Well, we had to convince the ground a little bit what was going on because they couldn't believe all this was happening at one time. And when they finally said, you know, you better get into that lunar module and use it as a lifeboat, well, Fred Hayes and I had already met each other at the tunnel and were climbing our way through. The first thing the ground said, why don't you get back on that free return course? So they told us how to maneuver the spacecraft, and we used the lunar module to do it. We turned on all the systems of the lunar module, and then lit the descent engine, the engine that we're going to normally use to land on the moon, on the lunar module, and used it to move us over to that free return course again. Now the ground was tracking us on their large radars, so they knew where we were. And by this time, of course, after we did that maneuver, we looked out, of course, the moon now is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're less than 35,000 miles away, and we're speeding up our trajectory right towards the moon. Well, Fred Hayes in the back of an old envelope was trying to figure out, do we have enough battery power in this lunar module to get home? Do we have enough oxygen to breathe in the lunar module? And how about water to cool all of our systems? You see, the lunar module was designed only to last 45 hours, just to land on the moon and come back up, rendezvous, and then we threw it away. Yet we are 90 hours from home. Well, it turned out that oxygen was not a problem because we had oxygen in our backpacks and we had to decompress the vehicle and then recompress it again, so we had plenty of oxygen. But battery power would long be consumed before we got back safely into the atmosphere. And water was a problem too. The ground, of course, by now, realized the same situation. And they called up and said, you're not going to get back before you run out of electrical power, and you will never be able to control the spacecraft for a re-entry. We said, we know that. They said, we think down here we have an idea. And we said, well, what is it? And they said, as you round the moon, because the moon's gravity is going to pull you around, after you pass the backside of the moon on the way around, we're going to have you light that descent engine a second time, and we're going to leave it on for a long period of time, and maybe it will push you faster and faster and faster back towards the Earth to get into that atmosphere before you run out of battery power. We said, fine. They said, now we have really never researched this too much, but we're going to send a backup crew down to the simulators and see if this thing really works. They said, now you have to be prepared to copy the procedures down right away, because when the moon pulls you around, you lose communication with us. And we said, fine. A little while later, they called up and said, we think this is going to be okay. Are you ready to copy? And I said, fine. And I had my two companions up here now, all in the lunar module, and I started to write down the procedures, and I looked at my companions, and they weren't listening. They both had cameras in their hands, and one fellow's looking at aperture settings, the other guy's looking at shutter speeds, and they're looking out at the moon. I said, gentlemen, what are your plans here? And they said, Jim, as we get pulled around to the backside of the moon, we're going to take some pictures. I said, if we don't get home, you won't get them developed. They said, Jim, you've been here before. Doggone it, we haven't. We like to take pictures. Anyway, they took their pictures. We finally got our act together. We lit the engine for a second time. On the way back, we left that engine on for about 4.5 minutes. And it kept pushing us faster and faster and faster and faster on the way home. After that, we shut the engine off, and then we turned off all the electrical systems. You know, the systems that you would never be caught out there without. The guidance system, the computer, the digital autopilot. The only thing we had going for us was a little fan to circulate the atmosphere in the spacecraft and the radio to talk to the Earth. Everything else was turned off to conserve electrical power. And you know, when you're in sort of a tight situation and there's really nothing to do and everything is real quiet, that's dangerous. Because you start thinking where you are. And I think it was Swiker that came up and said, you know, I think we're exceeding escape velocity. Now let me explain that. If I walk outside of the hotel and I have a baseball in my hand and forget the atmosphere for 1 second, and I throw that baseball up in the air a little over 25,000 miles an hour, the baseball will not come home. The baseball will not go into an orbit about the Earth. It will escape from the Earth and go into an orbit about the sun. I said, don't worry about it. We probably are. In fact, the ground called up and said, and they were tracking us on their big radars, you're really hauling the mail. But you're on that free return course. Let me explain how we make a landing back here on Earth. If this is the atmosphere, just a small segment, this is, you know, just a flat area, we have to come in a 2-degree pie-shaped wedge, no less than 5.5 degrees, no greater than 7.5 degrees, a 2-degree pie-shaped wedge coming down that corridor. That's the free return course. If we come in too shallow, we skip out, like skipping a stone on water. If we come in too steep, the sudden deceleration would make us a fiery meteor for a few brief seconds over the night sky. I said, don't worry, folks, we're on that free return course. At 102 hours after we had taken off on this mission, the ground called up and said, we have been tracking on, you with our radars. And for some reason, and we don't know what's happening up there, but you're no longer on the free return course. And if you continue the course that you're on, we have extrapolated the trajectory and you'll miss the atmosphere by about 65 nautical miles. I said, well, thank you very much. Great information. But we've turned off the computer. We don't have the computer anymore. The guidance system is shut down. We have no way of accurately pointing the spacecraft to make a maneuver. You know, we don't even have an autopilot. The clock has stopped. And they said, Jim, we have one idea. And I said, fine, what is it? And they said, do you remember back in Apollo 8 when we had those emergency procedures in the back of the flight manual in case the navigation system didn't work or the communication system went bust or prayers failed to help you? And I said, I remember those procedures, but after 8 we tore them out of the manual because we never thought we'd use the procedures. And they said, you're going to have to use them now. What that consisted of was to manually maneuver this combination spacecraft around to put the Earth in the window of the lunar module. In that window, I had a little crosshair, a little gun sight we used for rendezvous. If I could put the terminator of the Earth, and that's the twilight, daylight on one side and darkness on the other, out in space it's a rather sharp line. Of course, it takes a little while to go across on the ground. But if I could put that terminator horizontal with my little horizontal line on my gun sight, then that would place the engine such that I could either steepen up or shallow out the angle if I lit it at just the right time on the way home. That was the procedure. Since the clock has stopped, you have a wristwatch. You will time the length of time this burn will go on. And Fred since we have two controllers, two attitude controllers for the spacecraft, I know that when that engine goes on full blast without a autopilot to help me control the attitude of my spacecraft, because it's in such a funny configuration, that you take the backup controller and I'll take the primary controller and I'll keep the Earth from going up and down too much in the window if you keep it from going horizontal too much. He said, fine. We had two windows right there. On the side of my console, and it was somewhat similar to this podium, on the side of the console I had two buttons. One said start and the other one said stop. These were direct electrical links from the battery to the engine. The one and only time they were ever used in the space program. At the proper time on the way home, Jack said start. I hit the start button. The engine went on full blast. I jockeyed the Earth vertically. Fred jockeyed it horizontally. And 14 seconds later, I hit the stop button. And the engine shut off, and then we waited. We waited for the ground to pick us up on the radar to see if we'd gotten back into that corridor to come in and make a safe landing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would not be here tonight if I did not come in successfully. We came in actually 6¼ degrees and landed in the Pacific Ocean where we would have landed had this mission been normal. I might just mention two things. First of all, it was the cause of the accident. The cause, and it took us 3 months to determine what caused this accident. The accident was set up 5 years before we took off. At that time, NASA said, make the spacecraft compatible with high voltage that we had at Cape Kennedy. I think it was 56-volt DC power type voltage at Cape, even though the spacecraft flew with 28-volt power. All the people concerned with the electrical components of the spacecraft made their systems compatible with the 56-volt power, except the fellow who built the heater system in the liquid oxygen tank. In that little heater system was a device called a little thermostat. It was to protect the heater from overheating if electrical power was applied. It was compatible with only 28-volt power. No one thought to put one in compatible with the higher voltage. This spacecraft, unlike the other spacecraft, about 6 or 8 weeks before the flight, had power applied to that heater system for about 8 hours. No one knew that when the heater system was turned on, after a while, the little contacts in the thermostat started to open up to shut off the power. But because it was only compatible with the lower voltage, and there was higher voltage applied to it, when the contacts started to open up, they were welded shut. And there was no protection of the heater system. We know now from laboratory tests that the temperature inside the liquid oxygen tank in that heater system on the launch pad got up to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Damaged all the wiring, and the wiring was coated with Teflon. But no one caught it. Just about on the day of the launch, we loaded the large tank with liquid oxygen and took off. 2 days later, when Fred and I were in the lunar module, and I had just finished the television program, the ground, seeing the pressure in the liquid oxygen tank decrease a little bit, told Jack, as the last thing to do that day, why don't you turn on the heater system and boil off a little of the liquid and build up the pressure in your tank. Fire in the tank blew the neck of the tank off. All the liquid oxygen rushed out of that tank into the bay where the tank was stored, and it's in the vacuum. There was no atmosphere in that bay. The liquid then flashed into a gas. The gas pressure blew the entire side of the spacecraft off. And that is the explosion we heard, not the first one. But the catastrophic thing about it was that second explosion ruptured our second and redundant oxygen tank, and that was the gas that I saw escaping from the rear end of my spacecraft. I call this flight a success's failure. It was certainly a catastrophic situation. But the moral of the story is unique. The fact that we could take the competence of the technical groups of the contractors and NASA to take an almost certain catastrophe, multiple failures, and in a matter of hours determine procedures to get us home safely, really shows us the technical capability of this country. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, this flight, I think, was one of the most successful flights of our space program. Thank you very much. Well, I mean, I don't know. You're the MC here.
Do we have any questions for Captain Lovell? Gentlemen, go ahead.
What about the explosion of the Challenger compared to the explosion you had? Do you see a parallel or
Now, the explosion of the Challenger and the explosion of what we had, there was no parallel. The Challenger exploded still in an atmospheric condition. It was more like a wing falling off an airplane or an engine quitting. When we had our explosion, we were in a weightless and a drifting motion, being guided by the gravity of the three bodies. And also, there was really no escape for the Challenger people. Now, they do have on board now a bailout system, which if something like that occurs again, they might have a way of escaping. But you really have to rely on the design and the reliability of the equipment that you're flying with in the shuttle program.
Well, wait a minute. Hold on a second. We have a gift for Captain Lovell that I will give to you at a later time. Please don't take off without it. And one last thing, Val, would you come up, please? Support of the program tonight. And I'd like to thank every one of you for coming tonight and making this yet another success. We will close with a benediction from Pastor William Jones.
In the form of a charge. We've had a most enjoyable evening. We've honored those who have made unique contributions to their community and in their particular field of work. Captain Lovell has taken us on scary adventures into outer space and helped us to identify with those. And so now as we go forth into these days and into the coming year, let us continue to use these spatial gifts that God has given to us. And as we do so, may He bless our every effort.